20 years ago, authentication meant a password. 10 years ago, it was a smart card or a one-time passcode token, but things are really changing quite a bit these days, as we've heard. So to moderate this panel, I am pleased to introduce my venerable colleague, Grant Schneider, who will be popping on in just a moment, and also introduce our other panelists, Grant and Pam and Christine. Thanks.
Thanks, Jeremy. Really appreciate it. It's been a great event, and if we can go ahead and get the other panelists to turn their videos on, we'll get started. I want to thank the Better Identity Coalition and FIDO and Identity Theft Resource Center for hosting us. This really has been a great, I guess, almost day and a half now. I do think we're going to build on some of the themes that you've already heard, and we'll probably double down on a couple of them as well. But I want to introduce our panelists that we've got here today. I'm really honored and excited to be here with them. First of all, we have Grant Dasher. Grant is leading identity and access management issues at CISA, the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency. I think everyone knows that acronym. Previously, Grant worked at Google, where he was a principal software engineering director focused on authentication, identity, and security for Google Cloud. Grant also worked in the US Digital Services during the Obama administration, supporting immigration benefit processing at USCIS, among a number of other projects. So Grant, thank you for being with us here today. Secondly, we have Pam Dingle. Pam is the Director of Identity Standards at Microsoft. Pam has 15 years of experience in implementation and architecture of identity standards for web access management and provisioning and federation. As the Director of Identity Standards at Microsoft, Pam leads a team of experts dedicated to collaboration within the industry to imagine, author, and drive adoption of identity standards, including single sign-on, API security, next-generation credentials, authentication, and blockchain, pretty much everything. So we're thrilled to have Pam here with us. And then Christine Owen. Christine is the Director of Advanced Solutions for Cybersecurity at Guidehouse. Christine is a self-proclaimed recovering attorney, which I take differently now that I work at a law firm, but a self-proclaimed recovering attorney who found solace in identity and access management consulting. She's focused on securing people, things, applications, devices in the cloud through better identity and better identity management. Christine does a lot of work inside the federal space. And in my opinion, she's really the heart and soul of federal identity management. And at some point, we'll be able to have happy hours again, and everyone can come and see that demonstrated. So without further ado, would love to jump into some questions. Grant, I want to start with you. I think Jeremy asked me to moderate this because he really liked the idea of having 3 grants in one sphere all at once, because that's relatively rare. But I want to pick up on what Andrew just talked about. The Biden administration put out specific guidance around the implementation of non-phishable MFA, and CISA recently highlighted FIDO as the gold standard. What is driving, in your mind, this apparently renewed focus on identity, and what type of feedback, what are you hearing from agencies?
Yeah, sure. That's a great question, Grant. And no, I always appreciate being on panels with multiple grants. I don't do it very often. Yeah, so it's really great to be here and speak to you all. I think that, to answer the question, I think we've known for a while that identity is the source of a large number of breaches, and in particular, phishing in particular. There's been a lot of research by my former employer and others that have sort of demonstrated that it's a very common vector by which people compromise networks. And I think that really, with the shift that's been going on in the industry, that's been sort of hypercharged by the pandemic, where people are moving, to more remote work posture, introduction of cloud, introduction of mobile, all of these factors, the traditional, network-centric security architecture has had so many holes punched in it to support what people need to do for successfully executing their missions, that it's really sort of become untenable. And so there's been a move towards a different security architecture, which has identity at the core to defend against those environments. And I think that when you move into that world, you really need to focus on issues around authentication and phishing in particular, since it's sort of a foundational piece if you want to build your security architecture around that. And I think in terms of agencies, look, agencies are organizations. They are, in many cases, they range from tiny agencies that are very similar to small businesses to large enterprises that are, in some cases like the DoD, larger than any real private sector entities. And they have the same problems, right? In terms of their workers, needing to be remote, operating from different environments, incorporation of cloud technologies, all of these problems, and agencies are really trying to grapple with how to make this transition. Now, interestingly, the government has been invested in phishing-resistant authentication for a really long time with the PIV program, and one of the largest deployments of PKI at scale that's out there. But the interoperability with the broader market is critical in order to be efficient at spending taxpayer dollars and so on. And so I think the government is really interested in exploring the evolution of other technologies like FIDO in the authentication space that are being adopted in the broader community. And agencies are doing the same, right? There are places where PIV cards don't work. They need to explore other technologies that provide comparable security in order to authenticate their employees and partners.
Now, thanks, Grant. That's really helpful. And you noted that, and this is something I've thought. There's no one size fits all for government or for industry, right? Organizations are individual, but government has generally led in a lot of ways on multi-factor. But then government's kind of hard to shift and hard to change gears. Pam, I guess, what are you seeing with commercial organizations from multi-factor? They typically get to be or demonstrate a little more agility, I think we consider, than a lot of government organizations, but in a lot of ways have been later to embrace MFA. But what are you seeing as you work with organizations in the commercial space?
So we're seeing strong adoption right now, very strong adoption. However, strong adoption still doesn't mean 100% adoption. It means, I think the number that I have most recently is 32%. If you look at our platform, and that may or may not be representative of the industry, I suspect it is. So, from a commercial perspective, what we're seeing is folks focus on flexibility and focus on combining multiple factors. And by that, I mean multiple form factors. So rather than trying to put all their eggs in one basket of one type of thing, they tend to be trying to create a suite of factors that will give them, account recovery, that will give them, just ways to fail gracefully, but also ways to handle non-standard workers. So, so we're really seeing, I would say right now, creativity about solving their problems. We're seeing, a lot of interest in NIST 800-63, not only in the US, but worldwide, because it is sort of a gold standard for how you can calculate the risk that comes from authentication. And then the other thing that people are doing is they're not just looking at that one gate, they're actually building into their entire regime. So the buzzwords, if you want to talk about the identity buzzwords, we're talking about adaptive access, right? The ability to actually do threat detection, look at the risk associated to the user, right? And not simply believe that if they can pass jump through one hoop, that now they're trusted to the end of days, until they have to be forgotten and asked again.
No, that's, and I want to come back to the contextual piece that you were getting at in a little bit, but the 32% is surprising. And I guess, do you have any thoughts, and maybe it's just a guess as to what are the inhibitors? I mean, is it just behaviorally, people don't want to change how they're working? I mean, certainly the threat is is widely understood, most multi-factor implementations are easier, in fact, to use than remembering all the passwords, as Andrew just talked about, to a large degree. So what are you seeing as the barrier to raising that number?
So I think there's two types of organizations. There are the organizations who are big enough and who have sort of the security apparatus to understand that they should be using MFA, but they have organizational barriers. So a lot of our customers come to us and say, you know, they're sort of agonized, right? They know they need to do it, right? But they have legacy technology or they have other reasons why they can't adopt. And to them, I have so much sympathy and I'm really sorry. For everyone else, though, it's really, I believe, it's on people's lists, right? It's there. But what, you know, the adoption, we are seeing strong adoption right now. And part of it is because of the supply chain risk. So what's happening right now is that, you know, the attacks are targeting not the big guys or the big entities, but the small ones. And so, you know, the folks that we're seeing adopt right now in a big hurry are the ones in a supply chain ecosystem who are seeing, you know, the company beside them fall. And so, you know, so that's the other piece we're seeing. We're seeing hurried adoption by people who suddenly recognize risk. We're seeing, you know, we're seeing people really try to push forward past their barriers. And then there's just this big pool of folks who don't know, or, you know, who just simply haven't seen, you know, they haven't got to it on their lists yet.
I'd like to add a couple other challenges that organizations would have to getting to full multi-factor adoption, like ubiquitous throughout their system. I think one of those is really mobile devices, because if you lock down an application to only accept multi-factor and you can't achieve that on the phone, then you can't have people be as mobile as they are today. So that, like, whoever is out there working on mobility and getting multi-factor on the phones, please start going faster for us, because I think that would be super helpful. That's one problem. I know that the federal government's working on that because there's a lot of push on derived PIV, and that's something that we've been working on with some of our clients in the federal government. So that is one way to fix that. But then once you get that, we also have to have the user application to actually accept that derived PIV. So then it gets really messy, and then the question is like, is this really an AL2 or AL3? Because is it single factor or multi-factor? Because you have to add a PIN. Anyway, that's one factor of that. But the other one would be service accounts and other RPA accounts. And adding multi-factor to them is not always as easy as it seems either. I know a lot of organizations use PAM solutions to be able to protect those accounts. But again, you also have to have your target applications be able to interact with that PAM solution to be able to get that protection. And then again, that's the same like question, is that really multi-factor, or is it just a really long SSH key? So like, does it violate or does it not? So it's questions like that that I think is really hard for organizations to be able to get to that 100% multi-factor solution.
Yeah, thanks, Christine. That certainly makes sense and is helpful. And I want to ask you about something else that Pam mentioned, and she talked about it being on people's lists. And you know, federal agencies have long lists of to-dos. There was an executive order a year ago. Eric alluded to it this morning that had a whole bunch of to-dos. He also is getting ready to very soon, bold and italicized, I think the way he put it, put out a zero trust strategy, which is undoubtedly going to add to agencies' list of to-dos. How are you seeing agencies prioritize identity? Like, is it making it to the top of their lists, or is it just an item on the list because the lists are getting so long?
I would say it's an item on the list because the list is so long. And I don't think that is saying that identity isn't important to agencies. It absolutely is. It's been something that's been important for, I want to say, since the beginning of time, but that's not true. But since the PIV program started, I think it's been important. It's been a FISMA question for a gazillion years. I feel like, you know, at first the question is, are you issuing PIV? The answer was no for a really long time. You know when that was, Grant, it made me sad. And then it moved over to, are you actually using PIV? And now it's saying, are your systems actually using PIV? So we're like migrating to figure out where that hole is for PIV usage, or just multi-factor in general, because really we switched to the question of AAL3. But the point here is that like it's absolutely a part of that long priority of lists. Obviously, it's high up right now because there is a requirement for MFA by the middle of March, as is the same for encryption of data at rest and in transit. There's a mid-March date for that as well. So those are the things that I think agencies are working on furiously, but then there's been a lot of bumps in the road. We still don't have a budget passed by Congress for agencies. Getting cybersecurity people onboarded into federal agencies sometimes is like pulling teeth, because you have to first find them and then you have to wait what seems like 100 years to get them onboarded. And then the last thing I think that's really important is that we also have a lot of additional directives and BODs coming out from CISA and OMB that are equally as important as all these other things, right? Like Log4j, super important. So everyone had to kind of drop everything, fix that, and then move forward. And I think that that's going to continue on. So it makes progress take longer, I think.
Yeah, you hit on a whole bunch of issues there. And I mean, some around just like compliance, right? Are we asking the right PIV questions to really drive this security piece? But I want to hit, and Grant, maybe ask you a little on the prioritization piece. And, you know, to Christine's point, all of these issues are important, and we need to do all of them at once, but agencies can't. They're just not going to be able to. Is CISA looking at, or working with OMB and others, you know, how to help agencies prioritize? And one agency's priority may end up necessarily being different than another agency's, just because where they're at from a starting standpoint. But how are you seeing agencies, and are you guys able to help them with that?
Yeah, I mean, I think the answer is yes, we are at multiple levels. You know, we have a whole, you know, part of CISA that's responsible with, you know, working with agencies at the line level to try and, you know, get to, you know, strategies for each agency to execute different parts of this. So some pieces of that, like the CDM program, have been going on forever, but there are other efforts you know, within CISA to do that kind of tactical work. At the same time, though, we're trying to make some sort of more strategic investments in terms of, you know, shared services and other things like that, that especially for some of these small agencies, you know, will provide a sort of a template. You know, you want a pre sort of configured, you know, DNS solution, or perhaps email solution, things of this nature that, you know, will allow sort of step improvements for some of these smaller agencies in their cybersecurity capabilities. You know, in terms of prioritizing the work, I think that, you know, it's a tough balance, but I spend a lot of time talking to Eric and Chris DeRusha up at OMB about how to, you know, how to balance between, you know, sort of incremental improvements and really driving towards a zero trust architecture, which has a core identity foundation. And I think that's really critical. Is, you know, oftentimes, you know, we're sort of racing, trying to do as much as we can in a short period of time, but some of these transitions require really sort of figuring out, okay, how do we get to an architecture that fundamentally changes the security properties of the environment? And so I think there's a balance there. I think that there is a sort of work on both sides of that, you know, to be seen how successful we are, but I certainly think that, you know, I think others at CISA repeatedly say that identity is the foundation of a zero trust architecture, and the president's executive order has committed the government on both the civilian and recently on the NSS side, national security system side, to go in that direction. So I certainly think, you know, identity is high up there in the priority list. As Christine said, you know, a big problem is just a lack of capacity, right? We just need more cybersecurity people in the government working on these issues at all levels. We've said that repeatedly as CISA. You know, there's some new hiring authorities that are hopefully going to help with that. We'll see how that all plays out. But yeah, I mean, it's a difficult question.
Yeah, and one other item that, and completely agree. And I think a challenge, and Christine mentioned this, is, we're under a continuing resolution. And, in fact, there's been no new, and even the 22 budget that we're hoping to get was well baked before the cybersecurity executive order came out, and well before Log4j and a lot of the other things took place. And so even once we get that budget, which presumably is going to have hopefully we will get it, and it'll have some additional funding for CISA and others in this space, but that still is kind of behind the needs that we have. So to our friends in Congress who are watching and tuning in, please help get that done, because it's going to be really important. Pam, I want to talk a little bit more on the move towards passwordless. Do we get to kill the password? Are organizations thinking about that? But I want to also add in, we got a question from the audience around, are we thinking about identity for inclusion and accessibility for others, for everyone, as we're thinking about solutions. So not just what's the most secure solution, but what's going to be inclusive, and is killing the password kind of part of that? So I threw a couple of things together at you. Apologies.
No, it's good. So yeah, we're very aware of the inclusion and accessibility pieces. I mean, part of what it means to have a flexible multi-factor regime is to not force somebody to use a form factor that just can't work. So there are, and of course there are many types of inclusiveness and many types of accessibility. So that's the other thing. You don't just get to check mark one thing and say, this is our accessible option. You need to look at, you need to be able to handle people who have lost a finger. You need to be able to handle people who have low visibility, but you also need to handle things that are much, that aren't sort of the easy poster child examples as well. So, that's a piece that is less, though, part of the standards and more part of the implementation, and a piece that I think individual companies get to show a lot of leadership on, right? What they do, when they do it. There's also very simple things like how integrated is your authentication regime into your computer, right? So when you think about localization, right? Are the hoops that you're expecting your users to jump through localized? I mean, there's just a lot of things that, we have a huge opportunity right now, because our authentication is becoming more and more built in to what we do. It means that some of these operating system level activities can, the operating systems are designed for the globe, right? And so it changes the work that vendors have to do to make sure that they can help people. So I know that's it's a general answer, but we are absolutely thinking about it. And I'm trying to not reference any particular work from any particular vendor as well, because I know that you would all prefer that. But as far as passwordless goes, this is a really interesting question, right? You have to plan for the future. We absolutely want to kill passwords, but the most important thing right now is not killing passwords. The most important thing right now is removing fraud. And that is a different thing. Like, killing passwords is a philosophical, happy feeling, of a job well done. But ultimately, if you use passwords, but you use another factor on top, if you have to layer your factors together, you're doing something more important than merely killing the password. And so, I really want to make sure people understand. And not only that, even 100% multi-factor in your organization is not the goal that makes sense for anyone who isn't an organization with the 10-year plan, right? If you've got a 2-year goal, then protect your admins, right? So, if I want to talk about catchy slogans that are really not very catchy, right? Protect your admins, MFA your admins, right? If you could do only that, and if that's all you have the money or the time or the resources to do, for the love of Pete, please protect your admins.
No, that's great, Pam. And I also want to ask you, and you started to talk about this earlier, and we talked about it last week when we did our prep call, the whole idea about contextual authentication and the fact that, traditionally we check identity once, we grant access, and then at some point, the token gets revoked. And when you log off, when you walk away, go to lunch for too long, at some point your access is pulled away. But what are you seeing, and where do you think the future is going to be around more resilient and reactive and insightful ways to think about access?
Yeah, I mean, identity and security are just becoming closer and closer. That is the future of identity, is we sort of in some ways remove the silos that have been artificially created between those two entities. But what we're seeing right now that's important, is all of the background checks, all of the context that we're looking at, all of the breached password databases, right? So these systems are checking live a whole bunch of factors that are passive factors, right? So not just the hoops you jump through, but are you an outlier? Is your user overprivileged? That's one of the newer and more fancy ones, right? Is what you're doing consistent with what you did last week? Can you, has your name shown up in a breach in the last little while? Right? All of these factors are now combining.
Isn't the answer always yes to that?
Well, possibly, but you only have to act on that. In theory, you only act on it when it happens originally, right? But that so that idea, when I talked about adaptive access before, there's two pieces. You have to be able to detect that something's wrong, but then you have to be able to act, and that's the other piece that's really in the future right now. We are trying to react in as close to real time as we can. So for example, there's a thing called continuous access evaluation, right? So we're not going to give you a whole bunch of tokens and cookies, right? And let you have them for a day. And if you get, if something happens an hour in, you still have them for the day. We're trying to work as an industry, and it's really hard. We've defended on cookies for a long time, right? We're trying to get to the point where we can claw that access back. No matter where you are, no matter what device you're on, we can't, your access stops and you're asked to re-authenticate, you're asked to reset your password, whatever action is next. So that's really, I shudder to say the future because we're working on it now, but it's a very long tail goal.
Yeah, I just wanted to add a little bit on that point. I think it's really critical. I've never really understood some of the reasons why the industry has sort of evolved in the way it has, between the sort of segregation of the identity community and the security community and things of this nature. And also, all the focus on primary authentication, as an event, and then somehow magically you're in good shape. But we've seen, with real actors in the wild, real actors aren't confined by the way in which we've sort of organized our own problems conceptually. And so, for example, we've seen this for decades in Windows with, sort of golden ticket kinds of Kerberos attacks that are compromising, internal credentials that are post-authentication tokens. We've seen it more recently with, or at the same time, really, in the space of SAML, cookie theft, golden SAML attacks, bearer token compromises, replay, all of this, right? All of these techniques that people use compromise different portions of the authentication after the primary sign-in event. And it's a real critical piece of the overall puzzle. And so I think that this effort, I think in some people's head, there was this magic notion that, we have a credential, our PIV card, and now we just can do mutual TLS every time for every transaction. Our computers aren't that fast. The smart cards aren't that fast. It just doesn't work, right? That's not actually what anyone does. They do a single primary authentication event, and then they have, derivative credentials. And so I think as an engineering problem, figuring out how to do this continuously, to continually analyze the sessions, to invalidate them, to leverage, other, risk signals, other kinds of things. Machine learning, people like to talk about, it's always been a bit of a holy grail, and some people might call it a white whale. But I think in general, this notion of not treating like sign in as a discrete event that you can put in a bucket and then be done with it, and just assume you have a magic token that solves all the rest of your problems. I think that's a critical observation that the industry is moving towards in many sort of different ways as it does. And I just really want to echo all the things that Pam said.
So this is like literally my favorite subject. I'm so sorry, Grant, but I really have to jump in on this one because
Please do.
contextual authentication is my favorite subject right now. And the one thing that I think is really critical on this is that there's not one product that can actually do contextual authentication by itself. It's impossible. You have to have multiple products integrated together, and then one of the products acts as the decision maker to determine essentially authentication and access control, and then also access revocation if necessary. And so to be able to do that, like the way I visualize this as like the centralized broker thing. And so you have lots of different endpoints that's talking back to that broker. So you obviously have your IDP that we're using, phishing resistant MFA, to get a user in if we can live in the idealistic world, which I love to live in. So that's going in there. And then we have some sort of cert or identifier on a device that feeds in and says, here's the device. And then on top of that, we have user past history, we have the user IP address, we have the user device health, and we have all the things that we can get, all of the information we can get, which we can do now because we have such great advancements in AI, plus great advancements in a lot of the products that we have. So then we add that together, and then we do that continuous evaluation that Pam was talking about. So I think it's really awesome, like where we are today, because I remember back in the day when we were talking through, like when we were reading ABAC stuff, and that's what we've been talking about for like decades, about what we're trying to get to, and we're finally closer and closer to there, and it's so exciting. So sorry.
No, that's great. That's great. This is a great conversation, and you know, exactly what we need to be thinking about. Pam, one question I wanted to ask you is, you've done a lot of work internationally and with standards bodies. How are you seeing the international community approach, you know, kind of all these subjects, but are you seeing us, you know, head towards some common ground, or are vendors going to need to deal with just a whole bunch of different regimes and a whole bunch of different directives, you know, globally?
So the industry is definitely coming together. There's a whole bunch of standards that are meant to do basically the things that Christine was talking about. So an example of this would be the Shared Signals and Events Working Group at OpenID Foundation. So they're working on the idea of basically sending those lightweight signals that could unite all the different products. And yeah, it can't be any single vendor. It has to be standardized. It has to be something that the vendors can write to the standard so that we can scale it, because otherwise you end up with holes in your architecture. So the OpenID Foundation is focusing on it heavily. There's also a piece called Demonstration of Proof of Possession, DPOP, which none of you should ever have to know about. But what Demonstration of Proof of Possession is all about is if you hand a token to an API because you want to get data back, it's the way that the API can actually validate that that the entity passing the token is the entity that was issued the token. So addressing token theft is yet another leg on this stool, right? Of really getting to secure sessions and to being able to revoke data when necessary. So they're working together. We have a long way to go. And part of this is just that not everyone sees the importance of it yet, but we will. We have it already. And the other thing is, none of you out there should have to care about this stuff. This should be the stuff that you ask for on an RFP. And then we as vendors all panic about and run off and try and get. At least that's the idea.
So I want to turn to a question from the audience that actually is kind of to that point. It's in the user's domain, and that's around password managers. And the question is, what is there value for password managers, and particularly, what are the risks or concerns if the device that you're running them on has been compromised in some way, shape, or form? Grant, do you want to jump in, or?
Yeah, look, I mean, I think this is a bit of a nuanced question. I think, CISA has said publicly, and I agree, that on net, for most people, password managers are a useful transitional technology. And I certainly try and use one, for managing my passwords. I think there's a lot of details, right? So there's a lot of, fly-by-night kind of password vendors, manager vendors that store all your passwords in the cloud and sort of expose you to certain kinds of risks by doing that. Some of them leverage end-to-end encryption, others don't. There's all sorts of details there, but I think, if you use a password manager that's built into a major browser, whether, Chrome or Edge or something like that, Safari, iCloud, you're in decent shape. And I think CISA would recommend that the vast majority of people do that for accounts that have passwords. I think in terms of compromising of the machine, look, you get into complicated questions about what kind of adversaries you're trying to defend against, what's your threat model. I'll just leave you to note that if your machine is compromised with malware, whether your password is lost or not doesn't really matter, because, for example, someone can swipe your cookies and have their malware just sort of act as your computer and access all of your data. And so, yeah.
No, I remember I was over at OPM right after the OPM breach, and I got asked, by people, oh, was the data encrypted? And it was kind of the nature of that. I don't know that it would have mattered because of where the keys would have been and that type of an instance. Pam or Christine, anything to add there?
I use a password manager. I couldn't survive without my password manager. I think for most people, managing passwords most of the time, a password management, some kind of regime for password management is absolutely critical, and that the benefits outweigh the risks by a lot. The other thing is that, whatever you do, you need to not reuse passwords. This is the number one thing. Like, there's a whole entire attack called password spray, where all they do is they calculate the psychology of human beings and figure out what password, given the password policy that someone has set, right? Like, you have to change it quarterly, and it has to have, punctuation. There's a whole thing where they just say, okay, well, human beings are most likely to say it's, let's see, quarterly. Okay, spring, because I can do that 4 times a year, right? 2022, because that's going to be unique because it's a new year. Exclamation mark. Oh, and I have to capitalize the front. So if you have a password of spring 2022 or 2021, exclamation right now, you're like in 1%. 1% of any given population will set that exact password. So all they do is they look for those types of passwords. So anything that's unique, anything that's not reused is a million times better than something you've reused.
Computers are much better at managing random shared secrets than humans are. And so, yeah.
No, absolutely the case. I want to ask each of you, like, what should organizations be doing today? Like, I mean, organizations are all on an evolution, right? And they're on an evolution towards greater security, and many of them are on a journey towards zero trust. So what are things that, and they're going to live in multiple environments for a while, right? There is no, I just get to leapfrog into the future, unfortunately, from a technology standpoint. I bring all my my baggage, if you will, or legacy with me. But what recommendations do you have to organizations? What should they be thinking about to do? What steps can they take now that are going to be somewhat future-proof and also be investments in the future? And Christine, can I start with you?
So this is another one of my really favorite topics. One, I think the others will probably, hopefully touch upon other parts. So the one thing that I think is really important is once you create that plan, once you do the market research, pick the vendors that you want to be able to move, migrate security architectures to zero trust. I assume that's what you want to do, right? Do the microsegmentation. The one thing that you have to put into your entire plan is a lot of testing. A lot of testing. So when we move from this, lateral movement security architecture to a micro segmented security architecture, we are literally breaking our systems and then we're rebuilding it. And so when we do that, we actually find that things break. So things that were created for a lateral movement within a system, a great example of that is remoting into someone's computer, having the help desk remote into someone's computer. That's super easy. And in the traditional security architecture sense, that actually becomes much harder in the zero trust architectural posture. And the reason is because that's the whole point, right? We want that lateral movement to be super hard. So it breaks. So then what do you have to do? Well, you find a breakage. You have to go figure out how to fix that breakage, find out what the right tool is, figure that out, and then move forward. So this is like, honestly, the testing portion is going to take you a much longer time than you expect as an organization. And it's something that absolutely has to be done so that you can build that system right the first or second time, maybe the second or third, but it's the way to do it, in my opinion. And it's going to take you a lot of time. For the federal government, it's a completely different way to buy products. It's not something that they're used to doing. They're not used to having, you know, year-long testing and like figuring it out and bringing in more products. But it's a completely different paradigm and something that needs to get done. And then also Congress, how do we fund that? I don't know.
I think that's going to be unsatisfactory to leadership that just wants it done tomorrow, Christine.
I know. I'm sorry to Eric.
Grant, anything to add on to that, or Pam?
Yeah, no, I mean, look, I think, you know, I think the thing that CISA is telling agencies in this context is, look, get caught trying, yes, make progress, pick, you know, a population of applications that, you know, that is narrow enough to actually make progress, that is simple enough to have, you know, realistic constraints that are tractable, but make sure you do this in a way that can grow over time, right? We don't want to just bolt more product into the technology. And so balancing that, you know, architecture and progress making is tricky and context dependent, but I think it's critical. You know, in terms of, you know, foundational things, I mean, look, no one is going to do wrong by making sure that they have a, you know, scalable, phishing-resistant multi-factor authenticator deployment for all of their populations of users, right? You know, starting with their admins and then expanding from there into the, you know, employees and then the mission partners, and, you know, getting to the more complicated use cases. That is a significant value add in its own, and it's a foundational piece of zero trust. So I think, you know, it's one of our proposed plays to agencies is to really sort of focus just on that question of, hey, do you have phishing resistant authenticator coverage for all of your relevant populations, you know, especially your admins? Because there are, to this day, and we can get into the reasons, but there are all sorts of little complicated reasons why, you know, sometimes admins are harder to do this to than, you know, regular users, but they're more important, as Pam said earlier.
So I think it's very clear from this that the thing you should do is listen to Christine, like from now on, like she needs like a weekly podcast or something like that. But you know, the reason why Christine is so right about the testing is that it's not just the jumping the hoop, right? It's all the things that wrap it. It's making sure that, you know, that it's an easy experience. It's making sure that you can recover against failure. It's making sure it works with all your different machines and all your different environments, right? We are working really hard to make it easier, but it's not perfectly easy. However, you have to protect, you know, get to MFA, protect your admins, do that first, and then, you know, learn from the process.
Well, and I think there really is, I'm hearing a message. I mean, this is a bit of a journey, and, you know, the ability to ensure that organizations understand that organizations, C-suites, you know, secretaries, deputy secretaries, et cetera, understand that there are no silver bullets is really helpful. And the user base as well, that there are things that, you know, seem like a frustration to them, but are actually a feature, and are there to help them and protect them moving forward. So one last, we did get a question, and Grant, I don't know if you're able to talk about the zero trust maturity model at CISA, whether it's going to be updated or anything new is coming, but we'll let you end on that and then get it back to Jeremy Grant for the break.
Yeah, so CISA released a draft ZTMM last year. It will be updated. You know, there's a lot of guidance documents in this space that CISA has been working with other agencies on. And just in terms of prioritization, this one has not yet gone through the pipe, but yes, it is our intention to update that document, you know, and finalize it.
it's some of that's tied to your recruiting and hiring, so you can get more of those documents out to the world. Well, thank you all very much. Really greatly appreciate you taking the time to be with us today, and all the insights and knowledge that that you've provided to the audience. So thank you very much. And Jeremy, back to you.
Great, thank you. From one grant to two other grants, and also Pam and Christine, I really appreciate you all taking time today. This was a great panel. Glad we could get you here for a few minutes. We're going to take a 15-minute break now. If you want to get a bite to eat, stretch your legs, just get away from the screen. I don't know about you, I always get Zoom overload. We'll come back at 1 o'clock Eastern time with a panel focusing, shifting really from authentication to identity proofing and looking at next-gen ID proofing, attacks and protections in AI. Oh my. So we'll see you in 15 minutes. Thanks.